On our pattern pieces for all the patterns that we're sewing with, we do have suggested buttonhole locations, but I think it kind of differs for everybody. And I think rather than just defaulting to that, I think it's worth it just taking a little bit of time to identify where you want your buttons to go. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of show you, I'll walk you through my buttonhole process. I'll put the shirt on. I find that spot that's at the fullest part of my bust where I want that first button, and I put a pin. And then once I have, actually, sorry, and I marked the wrong side. I'm marking the left side when we should be putting our buttonholes on the right side. So I'd actually want to mark that on the left side. So let me just transfer that pin. Yeah, we want to be doing this on the right side. So this is where my first pin is going to go. You can see here we marked the pattern according to where the pattern told us the buttons should go. And mine's kind of somewhere in the middle, so it's always worth to check this. Obviously, we're gonna put one up here at the neckline. We're gonna put one about here. But you can also put one, if you've ever noticed when you do up a button-up shirt, I'm trying not to affect my microphone. If I do up this button, and I only have another button here, sometimes it gapes here. So you can also choose to put a second button right here. So let's say I actually wanna have another button here. So I have one here, I want one here, and I want one here. So this is where that button gauge really, or sorry, the sewing gauge really comes in handy. Because I can come in here and I can stretch it out and I can figure out how far apart I want my buttons. So now I have one here, and one here. And of course, if you don't have a buttonhole gauge, you can also just do this with a ruler, right? I can measure from here to here, and I can decide how many buttonholes I want, and then I can divide that by the number of buttonholes I want. But this is just a little bit of a quick cheat. And then I can use that gauge, I'm gonna slide it down, and that's gonna help me evenly space. I'm gonna put a buttonhole at every 2 on this hole gauge. At every 2 little arms. Let's put one there. And then, you know, I can decide, do I actually want to come all the way down? Here's my hem. Do I want to put one here that feels a bit too close? So I'd probably actually just leave one here. The other place that we want buttonholes are on our sleeve. So I haven't actually attached the sleeve to the shirt yet, but it's worth talking about. So here on the cuff, you can decide, do you want one in the center or do you want 2? I tend to have 2 buttonholes. I like having one there and then maybe one about there. Or if you're someone who never ever does up your cuffs, guess what? You don't need to put any buttonholes here. I always roll up my sleeves, and I've just taken to not even putting buttonholes there because I know that I'm never going to wear the sleeves down. So, you know, you're either going to have 1 or 2 or no buttonholes here. And with a long placket like this, you might also want to have a buttonhole here. In traditional ready-to-wear, they often will do a buttonhole here, but they'll do like a smaller button, and we had that conversation in the supply section. You might find that you want to do one here and have it be a little bit smaller. So now that you've identified where you want your buttonholes, great, you have to identify how long you want them. So here I have a little button. I think it's about 12 millimeters. Let's use my gauge here. It's about 12 millimeters wide. And the general rule with buttonholes is that you should add about 2 millimeters on either side. So you're gonna add about 4 millimeters in length. So I always start with doing a test buttonhole. I'm gonna just go into my buttonhole settings here. I'm just gonna do a standard square buttonhole. And here I can change the length. So right now it's set to 16 millimeters. So as I start my buttonhole, it back stitches and then it sews forward. So just keep that in mind when you're sewing your buttonhole, that if it sews backwards, you want to be starting your fabric at the right place. Okay, so let's take a look and see what it looks like. So here's that first test buttonhole. I always, 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 always test, like sometimes more than once. And then of course, before we open our buttonhole, we want to put that fray stop on it. So it's going to prevent the threads from fraying. So here's that buttonhole. And I'm just going to open it and see if it's the right size. I always do this. When I test it, I also open it and I make sure the button's going to fit through. So I'm just using my buttonhole chisel. So you can see I've just opened the buttonhole using that chisel. And I'm going to just check the button and see if it'll fit through. So I'm always just going to go through and just test. And that actually feels like a perfect fit. I also just want to mention there's something called tearaway stabilizer. So if you are sewing really, again, flimsy fabrics, or maybe you didn't use strong enough interfacing and you're kind of worried, then what you can do is underneath your buttonhole, you can go and pin this in place, get some scraps of it. You can go and do your buttonhole and then you can tear it away. And it'll just keep it just helps stabilize the fabric while you're sewing, and then it just rips away. Now, because my machine sews backwards with buttonholes, I need to start basically at the beginning. So I'm going to drop my needle down where I want it to start. And I drew that buttonhole guide, and I'm just gonna make sure that I'm angling my work correctly. I'm just gonna adjust this. And wish me luck. I just want to talk to you about how to mark the button. Again, I know that we give you buttonhole locations, but even if you go and perfectly mark your pattern pieces, and you perfectly do it on either side, it's just there's always cases where things aren't perfectly balanced. And so I always think it's better to like manually check rather than just trust the marks that you made. So how I find buttonhole locations is I take the button overlap, I line it up on the underlap, and I make sure that it's lined up here at the top, at the band collar. And then I go all the way down to the hem and I make sure it's lined up at the hem. And then I might even go and do just a couple of pins throughout the middle to just make sure that I'm keeping everything nice and straight and level. And once you're confident that these are evenly aligned on either side, now you can actually go and mark your buttonhole location. So you're going to mark, for the ones along the placket, you're going to mark right in the middle of that placket, and I just go and use like a marking tool, pen or whatever. So you want to mark through to the other side of the placket. I'm going to do that here. And for this guy, you don't want to mark in the middle of it. You want to mark as far as you can, basically next to that bar tack. And the reason for that is that that buttonhole here serves a purpose, right? It's holding the collar tight. And if you put the button in the middle, it's going to pull, and it's going to pull as far as it can. And it's going to, it's not much, it's maybe a ½ centimeter, but you're going to lose that alignment. So if you want that collar to stay nice and tight, you want that button to be as close as you can to that edge. So you're just going to go and mark with a pen. And what might have happened as you were kind of pinning this placket closed is maybe it wasn't perfectly centered on this. And so what's really important here is this position. So you might have marked it a little bit off center. You want to make sure it's centered, that where you're going to sew the button is centered on the placket. You just want to make sure that you have it at basically the right height. So here I did a pretty good job. It's marked right in the middle. So once you have your button locations figured out, now it's time to sew them on. And I have tried so many times to sew buttons on, and then you go to your machine and you're kind of like trying to stick it there, and it's shifting all over the place, and it doesn't want to stay in one position. So here's a little trick to get your buttons to stay where you want, is just to use a little bit of Scotch tape. So I'm just going to use a little piece of Scotch tape. I'm going to center my button exactly where I want it to be. If you're sewing a button with 2 holes, you want the 2 holes to be parallel to the center front, so you don't want to sew it like this. You want to sew the buttonholes like that. And then you just use a little bit of Scotch tape like this to keep that button in place. And now when I go to my machine and I sew it, it's not going to go anywhere. So let's put another one in place. Now, one thing to mention is you're hand sewing your buttons. You don't need to use Scotch tape because you obviously have a lot more control. I only use Scotch tape when I'm going to do it at my machine. So here's a regular foot I've put on my machine. You don't need to have a special foot for this. I'm just going to look underneath and drop that needle down so it's right in the hole of the button. And then either using that zigzag stitch or the button stitch, I can do it just fine with this regular foot. So that wraps up my tips and tricks for sewing buttons and buttonholes.